Welcome to Rapid Fire Ecology. So, ecology is the study of how organisms interact with one another and their physical environment. When we talk about population ecology, this really concentrates on the factors affecting population size and the composition of that population. Things like birth rate and death rate, right? So you're going to have equations on that AP biology kind of equations sheet. But again, you're just going to do the number of births over the total or the number of deaths over the total. And then that will give you, so if you take the birth rate minus the death rate, that gives you the net reproduction. So how many net new organisms did you add? And you can use that to calculate the population growth by multiplying that by the number of individuals, right? And you can do practice problems like this, and I have posted the answer key in the notes on the actual PowerPoint. If you look at population growth over time, again, whenever you're looking at a graph, make sure you understand what the axes are. So here we're looking at the percent of the population, males versus females, in terms of their age. So Kenya, there's a lot more young people. That's in a rapid growth phase. In the US, we have more young people than old, so we have slow growth. And then in Italy, for example, the number of young people and the number of old people are similar, so that might be a lower or zero growth or a decrease. So the limits on growth in a population are determined by the environment's carrying capacity. So anything above the carrying capacity and the population size will decline. It can go slightly above, but then you will expect a drastic decline afterwards, right? So the carrying capacity really dictates how many organisms or how that environment can support a population. And when you think about carrying capacity and you think about environmental environments and populations, you need to remember that there are a lot of relationships between organisms that are really important, such as predator-prey relationships. So again, this type of graph would be much more likely to be on a multiple choice question, and you have to answer questions about that, or a free response, and then you have to determine what, kind of interpret the graph and then describe it. So again, make sure that you're looking at your axes, you're looking at the rabbit population and the lynx population. And what you'll see is after a spike of the rabbit population, then you see a corresponding but later spike in the lynx population because it's providing a lot of food and energy to support the lynx population. But when the rabbits crash, then you have a corresponding lynx crash because there's no food. Just want to point out that the Earth also has a carrying capacity, and we are expected to reach it at a certain time, and we would then expect a population drop because we are no longer able to support the human population on Earth. So this is something to think about when you make normal daily decisions in your life. Another thing to think about is that we are currently, due to the coronavirus, we're having a huge, much bigger number of deaths in the world than we normally have at this time. So predator-prey adaptations, these are pretty straightforward. Predators have very clear adaptations. Prey have very clear adaptations. And remember, adaptations are something that will help these organisms not only survive, but also reproduce. So there's a couple things that are interesting and that you should know about. One of them is mimicry, right? So there's two types of mimicry. One is Müllerian, meaning that the member of the group you should avoid. So for example, here are bees. They both have stingers. They both release toxins. They look like each other. One evolutionarily was mimicking the other as a like, hey, you know this one's bad, you should stay away from me too, I'm bad. And then we have Bayesian mimicry, which is really about bluffing. It's for example, the hoverfly that is completely non-toxic and doesn't have any stingers or anything, has evolved to look like the wasp so that other organisms will stay away from it. And the same thing happens with the scarlet king snake, which is non-venomous. It's kind of evolved to look like this one. So community ecology concentrates on interactions among organisms such as predation, competition, and how this affects the entire community structure. So you should know about food chain, always beginning with the producers. You should know about trophic levels. The first trophic level are always the producers. And then we go up in trophic level, eventually topping off with our apex predators that do not have any predators of their own. We also have food webs, which is really the interconnected feeding relationships within an ecosystem. And remember the simulation we did, so that you can kind of play around with these, and they have dramatic effects for the numbers of populations of the organisms. This is something you should know, this is a pyramid of net production. It represents a loss of energy transfer in a food chain, right? So if you look at this, we have 1,000,000 joules of sunlight coming into this environment. Then the primary producers can make 10,000 or use 10,000 joules of that net production, right? They can make 10,000 joules. Primary consumers 1,000, etc. Here in this idealized pyramid of net production, there is a 10% loss at every level, right? And if I gave you a different pyramid, you should be able to calculate the percent loss, right? By just dividing this by that, this by that, and this by that to figure out the loss. Biomass pyramids. So here, these represent what is called the standing crop, or the total dry mass of the organisms. So how many primary producers are there in comparison to primary consumers, etc. And we should always have more, terrestrial environments almost always have the most primary producers by a lot, right? And you see sharp decreases at every trophic level. However, there are some aquatic ecosystems that the very small protists, such as the phytoplankton, such as the zooplankton, can outweigh that, outweigh the primary producers. So ecological niches define the role and the position a species has in its environment. And every organism living out in the wild has a defined ecological niche. Right? And so if you look at anything out in the environment, you can then go try to find that ecological niche. So within even one tree, there are different regions of that tree that have ecological niches. So this little bird feeds specifically on the lower branches, whereas this one feeds at the tip of the branches and at the top. And there is competition between these. So this one has kind of worked out its ecological niche and will defend that. So there's two different kinds of niches. One is a ecological niche. This is kind of the role and position that it has in the environment. A fundamental niche is the niche that that a species can potentially occupy based just on where it would want to live, right? Whereas the realized niche is a niche that is actually occupied, and that usually has to do with competition from other organisms, right? So an ecological niche can be the realized niche. So it's just the ecological niche is the role and the position in the environment. The realized niche is where a species actually localizes based on all of the other interactions within the population or within the environment. A keystone species plays a role in the community that is way bigger than its abundance might suggest. So these keystone species are typically in very low numbers, but have dramatic effects on the rest of the entire community. A good example of that is in this food chain. We have the primary producers, and then the urchins, and then the sea otters, and then the orcas. And what we saw is what people have been able to show is that the otters are a keystone species, and removal of an otter causes the population of sea urchins to explode because they are no longer being eaten, and that then causes the kelp forest to be destroyed, and that means that all of the organisms relying on that kelp forest are gone. So sea otters, sharks, sea stars, and wolves are really good examples of of keystone species. Remember, the wolves in Yellowstone were really dramatic for not only changing the population of the organisms, of the animals, but also they really changed the landscape of the entire forest, which is really cool. Ecological disturbances such as fire, weather, catastrophic events, human-made issues can cause major ecological disturbances. And if you have an ecological disturbance, what that can do is cause your environment to go down all the way down to bare rock, which is called primary succession, or down to sparse grasses, which is secondary succession. Right? So the succession is the sequence of community changes after a disturbance, right? So primary succession going straight from rocks, which then usually you get your bryophytes or your mosses, then you start getting your grasses, shrubs, trees, and then you start getting your population of animals back. So regrowth after during a succession always starts with pioneer species, right? So a pioneer species for this primary succession would be mosses. The primary succession or the pioneer species in secondary succession are these sparse grasses, right? Then we get our intermediate species, and then we get our climax community, which is really a big healthy environment with all of the organisms in there. Ecosystems present all of the organisms in a given area as well as the abiotic factors, right? So biotic, living, abiotic, non-living. So the ecosystem, all of the living and non-living organisms and factors within an environment. And we have lots of different kinds of ecosystems on this planet. We have terrestrial, aquatic, artificial, grasslands, forests, deserts, etc. Those are all terrestrial. Here are some aquatic, freshwater and marine. And then we also have artificial, such as crops and aquariums that are man-made. They are still ecosystems though. They still have a community of organisms interacting with their environment. The biome is any of Earth's major ecosystems. So we have several different terrestrial biomes. This is a kind of a chart that one could see on, for example, a cumulative exam, where it would show this and you would have to interpret what this means, right? So again, look at your axes. You have your annual precipitation versus your annual temperature. So in places that have very low precipitation and very low temperature, that would be the tundra. And on the opposite, very high temperature and very high precipitation, you get your tropical rainforests, and they're kind of divided up in that way. Aquatic biomes are classified based on not only their physical environment, but also their depth, right? So we have lots of different freshwater biomes, and we also have saltwater biomes. And they're both characterized by adaptations of organisms for that particular environment, right? So we have different organisms that are suited for the deep open ocean versus different organisms that have evolved to be very successful living specifically in freshwater ponds. The energy flow in an ecosystem. Again, this is a kind of a diagram that you should be able to interpret, where we have solar energy as the main source of energy for this planet. It provides energy for the primary producers to create sugars and energy, which then are consumed by the consumers, etc. If you look at the energy flow, you see that energy flow in red flows through this environment and then can be lost as heat. Whereas the nutrients in the environment do not get lost as heat, but they rather recycle through this. So organisms have waste in the form of detritus, which then other microorganisms and detritivores can live on, and then that gets recycled back into the primary producers. The sun provides an abundance of energy for this planet. Only about 1% of it is converted into chemical energy in the form of chemical bonds by the primary producers. Energy transfer between trophic levels is usually about 10 or typically 10% efficient, right? So if we're looking at secondary production, what this means is it's the amount of energy in food that is converted to their own new biomass in the form of growth. So in this caterpillar, if there's a total of 200 joules of energy, only 33 joules of that is used for new growth. A lot of it is pooped out. Some of it goes towards cellular respiration, right? Obviously, these two, the ones cellular respiration and and growth, those are the ones that are kind of assimilated into the organism. Obviously, feces comes out as waste. So if you look at production efficiency, you're looking at the net secondary production, right? So again, that's the growth, times 100 divided by the energy that we're not using. So you should be able to calculate the production efficiency for different organisms. And what you will see if you do that is that insects have a very, very high production efficiency, and birds and mammals have a very low production efficiency. And a lot of that has to do with birds and mammals spending so much energy on cellular respiration and maintaining homeostasis, in particular body temperature. Maintaining a constant body temperature, takes a lot of energy and a lot of cellular respiration. So you can see there's very little going towards growth, but a large percent of that is going towards cellular respiration. When you're looking at nutrient cycling, this is by definition the uptake, use, release, storage, and recycling of nutrients in the environment, right? So the things that I think are really important for this are the things that we already know about, which I will point out, or things that have been stressed throughout the year. So most ecosystems receive an abundance of cellular energy, way more than they need, but limited amounts of chemical elements. So really, those chemical elements really depend on recycling of those in the environment. So for example, water. One of the ways, here I'm gonna go through there. Okay, so for the water cycle, you should absolutely know that this is very important for primary producers, that liquid water is very important for life on this planet. This is driven primarily by evaporation and precipitation, right? So evaporation from the ocean and precipitation in the ocean. Those are very, very important. Obviously, then that can move onto land and cause rain here, which can then run off. But the ocean is the main source for water on this planet. The carbon cycle. So what have we talked about that is really important for carbon? In carbon. Carbon dioxide is a huge, really, really important thing for cycling carbon on this planet. So I'm going to quickly go through that. So carbon dioxide is fixed in the Calvin cycle, which are the light independent reactions occurring in the stroma. So carbon dioxide comes in through the stomata. It gets fixed in the Calvin cycle to become glucose. That is a big, important part of the carbon cycle. Carbon dioxide from the atmosphere being incorporated into glucose by photosynthesis. We have consumers that can eat that and get that energy from there. So the major reserves for carbon dioxide are fossil fuels, fossil fuels. They're in soil through detritus, meaning waste and poop. So again, the most important part is carbon dioxide is fixed here from the environment, and then we can use that carbon in useful ways for these organisms and through cellular respiration. Obviously, human-caused things can cause extra CO2 in the environment. That's why we need a lot of plants and trees to take up that carbon dioxide and turn it into useful energy for us. The nitrogen cycle. When you think nitrogen, you should think that, and you should know, nitrogen, that's in amino acids, that's in proteins, meaning amino acids and proteins, but it's also a huge component of nucleic acids, right? You should already know that. So, let me just go back really quick. And remember that carbon is in every single biological molecule. Lipids, nucleic acids, proteins, and carbohydrates. A component of all of those. And we get most of that from carbon dioxide from the air. Nitrogen is primarily in biological molecules, proteins, and nucleic acids. So let me cruise through there. Okay, so plants are a huge are very involved in nitrogen cycling. So plants use ammonium and nitrate, um, and animals can use only organic forms of nitrogen, right? So animals are really using nutrients from, for example, plants that we can eat, and we take that nitrogen and we then can convert that into either using that for our proteins or our nucleic acids, all right? Um, on the other hand, nitrogen fixation, just like we talked about carbon dioxide fixation, nitrogen fixation is the ability of taking nitrogen from the air or from the environment, the atmosphere, and converting that into organic nitrogen compounds. So there's a lot of bacteria that can do the nitrogen fixing for us. They convert it into something useful, and then, such as nitrates or nitrates, for example, they get incorporated into plants, animals eat it, and then we get those for our proteins and our nucleic acids. Phosphorus, you should know. Phosphorus, where do we get that phosphorus, or where are phosphorates in our biological molecules? It's in nucleic acids and lipids primarily, right? Um, Primarily nucleic acids in the form of that phosphate for our nucleotides, such as ATP, and lipids in the form of that phospholipid bilayer, right? We need that phosphorus. So the phosphorus cycle, again, plants are really good at absorbing phosphate and using it to make organic compounds, and then animals can then eat those plants um, and get that phosphate and convert it to nucleic acids and or lipids. The largest reservoir for phosphorus is actually sedimentary rock in the oceans, which is kind of interesting, right? That sediment in the rock can then be go into our oceans um, and into our soils that then can be converted into our plants. All right, and that's it.